evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, February 5th. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is optimistic that Canadians will remain united, despite admitting that the country is not out of the woods yet and is still facing large U.S. tariffs on exports starting next month.
These past few weeks have been challenging, but that resilience, that camaraderie we've seen on display has been remarkable. And in the spirit of the Lunar New Year, I've never been more optimistic about Canada's future. We're not out of the woods yet. We need to continue to pull together and be there for each other. But as I announced yesterday, we reached an agreement with the United States to pause the proposed tariffs against Canada, along with our countermeasures, and working together to tackle the scourge of fentanyl. And, of course, we will keep working until those tariffs are off the table altogether. But the one thing that has shone through over the past few days is Canadians being there for their neighbors, for their friends, looking to buy Canadian goods, looking to find Canadian suppliers, looking to be there to support communities right across the country through these challenging times. That is the very best of Canada. We pull together when we're faced with challenges, and that's what we've seen from coast to coast to coast. We are more aligned than ever. We are more united than ever.
The Prime Minister made those comments during a Lunar New Year event in Ottawa on Tuesday night. Several key cabinet ministers were back in Washington on Tuesday, making Canada's economic case now that President Donald Trump has paused tariffs. Energy and Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson is optimistic, saying that there are opportunities for conversations to move away from the conversation about tariffs.
I firmly believe that collaboration is what makes this continent great, and it is what will enable our conversation to move from one about tariffs, which in my mind is a lose conversation, to one about prosperity and security, which offers a win-win. We have all, I'm sure, heard many times the adage that Canada and the United States are each other's best friend, closest ally, and most important economic partner. And beyond friendship and our economic partnership, we have long been steadfast partners on the world stage. That is ever more important right now, given the increasingly aggressive behavior of international actors like China.
Mr. Wilkinson is working with key Republicans to create a Canada-U.S. energy and resource alliance, part of an effort to align with Mr. Trump's goal of making America energy dominant. Canada's federal trade minister continues to work on a diversification strategy that launched in 2017 that somewhat pivots away from the U.S. Minister Mary Ng says Canada just signed a free trade agreement with Ecuador and is in talks with a bloc of 10 countries in Asia. This marks the 16th free trade agreement Canada has signed since it launched its trade diversification strategy. However, Ms. Ng says that there hasn't been much luck with traditional trading partners like the UK, who walked away from talks over access to Canada's cheese market. And while Mary Ng is looking to expand trade opportunities abroad, there is a growing push for Canada to remove interprovincial trade barriers to increase economic growth. The National Post's Rahim Mohammed has more on the size and scope of these barriers.
There's been a lot of talk about trade agreements we have with other countries. CUMSA, our trade agreement with the United States and Mexico, has been in the headlines a lot since Trump was elected. What Canadians might not know is there's a rather lengthy document called the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that regulates commerce between Canadian provinces and territories. It's just over 300 pages long. About a third of it is dedicated to provincial exceptions. I think the big one that people are aware of is alcohol. So here in Ontario, the LCBO it regulates and it's principally sells beer, wine, spirits. We've recently had a push here in Ontario for places like 7-Elevens and grocery stores to sell more alcohol. But the LCBO is the really big entity, and you have different regulations in different provinces. So they're about, I think the figure was 133 pages of provincial carve-outs that make it harder to sell let's say beer and wine from British Columbia here in Ontario, or let's say certain agricultural products, cheese, milk, from outside the province, in grocery stores here in Ontario. So all told, those kind of carve outs and barriers, they reduce trade between provinces to a point that constitutes a good chunk of our GDP. A figure I've seen thrown around by economists is somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 billion. We're a trillion dollar and change economy, so kind of 15-20% of Canada's GDP is locked up in these barriers that we have between provinces.
He also explained who is proposing what in terms of tackling the issue.
So this is an area where we've seen a lot of agreement across partisan lines. To their credit, the current Liberal government has taken this seriously. Their current lead on the file is Anita Anand, Minister of Transport, who I think most people across party lines would agree is one of the stronger and more credentialed, more competent Liberal ministers. So during the most recent cabinet shuffle, she was also given jurisdiction over internal trade. One recent initiative that she's overseen is a pilot program in the trucking industry to harmonize standards for training, standards for things like kind of weight limits, hauling, towing, etc., across jurisdictional lines. So you do see a lot of cross-partisan agreement that it should be easier to do trade, between Ontario and Quebec, or Ontario and Manitoba, than it currently is, and I think you've seen an increasing urgency. The issues with tariffs since President Trump has been elected, and the issues that have come to the fore in his first few weeks in office, has brought attention to the fact that, generally speaking, it's a lot easier for Canadian firms, Canadian enterprises to do business north to south. It's a lot easier if you're in Ontario to do business with Michigan or New York State than it is to do business with Quebec or Manitoba. And, there's not really a good rationale for that. So I think there's general political agreement across parties that we need to do more to break down barriers that provinces and territories currently have, preventing them from doing business with one another.
This morning, while at a press conference in Windsor, Liberal leadership contender, former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, began laying out his vision for what the federal government could look like if he becomes Prime Minister.
I just want to underscore that I couldn't be more serious. I will do whatever it takes to strengthen our economy and to protect Canadians. We can and must change so that we have one Canadian economy instead of 13. That means we need to harmonize the tangle of rules and regulations at all levels of governments that have meant that Canada, at least the Canadian economy, is less than the sum of its parts. We must break down barriers between provinces so that all Canadians have full access to our resources. Above all, in a divided world, we must rely more on each other because we are always stronger together.
Mr. Carney also highlighted the need for Canada to expand its trading relationships around the world.
But now that U.S. priorities are shifting, we need to change our priorities in ways that work best for Canada. We know we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. And so, while we should remain closely integrated with the United States in the auto sector, in energy and security, in the new areas that will drive jobs and competitiveness in this century, we must diversify our trading relationships. We should become the essential trading partners of countries that share our values, including the UK, the EU, and leaders in Asia. And we can do so through our leadership in clean energy, in critical minerals, and in the intelligence infrastructure of the AI revolution. We must leverage these strengths for the benefit of Canada and all Canadians. To do so, we have to create supply chain certainty by protecting economically critical infrastructure. And that starts with building and expanding our transportation corridors that connect Canada to global markets from coast to coast to coast.
All right, stay tuned. Up next, Public Safety Minister David McGuinty says that Canada and the U.S. have joined cooperation on managing the fentanyl crisis. And Pierre Poilievre calls for life prison sentences for what he's calling fentanyl kingpins. And many Canadians are seeking out ways to navigate around tariffs should negotiations fail during the 30-day pause. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Federal Public Safety Minister David McGuinty said during a press conference in Manitoba on Tuesday that the cooperation, participation, and teaming together that Canada and the U.S. are doing against the fentanyl crisis has him feeling confident in the U.S. government, saying that together they could, quote, wrestle these challenges to the ground.
We're getting this job done. We're going to be really wrestling this fentanyl scourge to the ground. It's a tragedy for so many families. Where will we be in 29 days? That's up to the president. We're going to continue to manage the relationship we've had with the United States for 150 years as best we can. We owe it to the Canadian people. We owe it to the American people. And the fentanyl crisis is one area where we have joint cooperation. The measures that were announced yesterday are very much about cooperating between our countries and between ourselves here in Canada. That's why some of these measures are already underway. Some of them are starting this morning. They're going to be rolled out in the next week or two. So we are convinced good efforts will prevail, good faith and goodwill.
Mr. McGuinty says that the country's new fentanyl czar position will serve as a liaison between Canada and the U.S. on cross-border efforts to curb fentanyl traffic. The Globe and Mail's Timur Durrani was one of the journalists who was on the press trip with the minister in Manitoba, and he has more on what is being done at the border.
Minister McGuinty was here in Manitoba yesterday, and by here I mean he was near the border doing a show and tell with a bunch of reporters, which he says is not a show and tell for Mr. Trump, but it kind of obviously came off that way. It was just showing people, hey, look, we're taking border security very seriously. There was a real big demonstration, a big hoopla around showing how one machine is able to look at different substances to see whether fentanyl exists in them or not. It was a kind of demonstration for these different politicians, including Manitoba Premier Wabkanu, who was there, Terry Duguid, who's the federal minister responsible for the prairies, and Winnipeg area MP Ben Carr. So a bunch of politicians basically trying to show, hey, look, again, we're at the border taking this very seriously. What we learned about the fentanyl czar there, though, is not a lot. We learned sort of things that, you would expect, which is that there's a lot of responsibilities being put on this one individual, but we don't know exactly when this new fentanyl czar will be hired. We also didn't learn any potential names for it yet. Again, these are all questions we posed to the minister. He said we'll have more to say on this matter in the next few days or by the end of the week in the case of any potential hires. It'll take a while yet. So the way that he's describing it is this, again, when I say a lot of responsibilities, this will be a person who will work with, name a department, and he or she is going to have to work with that, kind of a thing. And so there's a lot happening. There's a lot riding on this person. They're going to have to work with China and Mexico, according to the minister. They're going to have to work with Health Canada's laboratories on. There's a lot of different things at this point that this minister is telling us they're going to have to work with. We at the Globe are reporting, this is through my colleagues in the Ottawa Bureau, we're reporting a few different names. At this point, we're hearing about retired General Wayne Eyre, the former chief of the defense staff, as a potential choice, but we are also reporting that no decisions have been made. At this point, that's likely because, again, there are no real sort of good ways to go about this, right? At this point, I think a lot of people, there's going to be, whoever this person is hired for this, they're going to have to, really be the person that we convince Mr. Trump is the right person for this. And that's a lot, it's convincing an entire, White House administration that's hell-bent on imposing tariffs if we don't convince them. And they could go in every different way, as we've seen over the course of the last few days. So it's a lot of responsibility on this one person.
Meanwhile, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre released a video today calling for life sentences in prison for what he describes as fentanyl kingpins.
As part of my Canada First plan, that common sense Conservatives will bring in mandatory prison sentences including life sentences for anyone caught trafficking, producing, or exporting over 40 milligrams of fentanyl, and 15 years for traffickers caught with between 20 milligrams and 40 milligrams. The people we will lock away are not non-violent drug addicts. People with addiction are the real victims of these traffickers, and my government will offer them life-saving treatment and recovery services. Nor are we targeting the small-time dealer on a street corner, though he will face penalties too. Rather, my new law will treat fentanyl kingpins who kill thousands of Canadians each year like the mass murderers they are. By locking up the big bosses and throwing away the key, we will cut the head off the poisonous fentanyl snake. All of this to save lives, bring our loved ones home drug-free, secure free trade, and most of all, put Canada first.
BC has released a list of 18 critical mineral and energy projects worth roughly $20 billion that it said it's working to accelerate in the face of ongoing tariff threats from the U.S. The list includes mining projects that have received pushback from some First Nation groups in BC and Alaska, as well as an LNG project that had been opposed by some environmental organizations. The initial list is made up of projects that already have developed business cases, but still need some type of permit or approval from the government. While Mr. Trump's tariffs have been avoided for now, many Canadians are seeking out ways to navigate around tariffs should negotiations fail during the 30-day pause. Shannon Terrell from NerdWallet Canada joined us to explain the potential economic impact and the tech tools available for Canadians if the tariffs are implemented.
Generally speaking, for Canadians, the things that we import from the US, so primarily food, alcohol, consumer goods, clothing and electronics, and some household goods, so furniture and appliances, we should expect all of those to potentially become more expensive. We will also see those industries in Canada that are particularly exposed to US demand. Those are going to potentially be facing a decline. So that could impact job security. We could be looking at potential job loss and even business closure. More broadly speaking, we should expect inflation to potentially tick up again. By how much, it's difficult to say. We may even be looking at a potential recession as Canada's GDP contracts in response to that economic pressure. So there are a few different ways that those tariffs could impact Canada, but what I would hope for folks to take away from all of that is that we don't need to take this lying down, so to speak, and there's plenty of things that we can do, plenty of things that are under our control, and lots of ways to strategically spend and save money in the coming months. First and foremost, we might want to consider shopping Canadian and supporting local businesses. If those tariffs from the US come into effect, as I mentioned, we're going to potentially see price increases from the goods that we import from America. So choosing those Canadian alternatives may be more cheap than purchasing those American goods we're more accustomed to. So that's one thing we might want to consider. Purchasing Canadian also has a potential ripple effect for America as well. So when we choose Canadian goods over American counterparts, we're supporting our Canadian businesses, we're supporting the Canadian economy, but as I mentioned, we're reducing demand for those American companies that sell north of the border, and that puts pressure on the American economy. So in a way, shopping Canadian is a way for Canadians to not only potentially save money, but to be exerting pressure, making their voices heard, and voting with their dollars, so to speak. Now, I would want to highlight for folks when it comes to grocery shopping, we want to also be on the lookout for a few other ways to save, especially if those costs do rise. So I would encourage people to really be using technology to their advantage right now. One way that we can do that is with food rescue apps. So two popular options are Flash Food and Too Good To Go. These are apps that allow you to purchase food at a deep discount that is surplus or near expiry, and you may be able to really save money that way. Also, using technology to your advantage, perhaps we want to explore those couponing apps and those price matching apps. So, Flip and Rebie are another pair of options that Canadians might want to consider. And then, just generally speaking, we want to get strategic about how we are spending our dollars in the grocery store. So, shopping in bulk, perhaps spending or spreading across multiple stores if that's an option for you. Again, so many different tactics we can take here to be saving money on those essentials like groceries. Food is typically a major a cost concern for Canadians, especially as so many of the things that we do import from the US are things that hit our grocery stores. But in addition, I think folks are also concerned about the price of gas. So that is another major expense. We may see volatility there if these tariffs go into effect. To save money on gas, again, I'm going to encourage folks use those apps to your advantage. So we have apps called Gas Buddy and Waze. Both of these actually allow you to compare the cost of gas across different gas stations in real time. So you can use these apps to your advantage when you're out and about. You can find the cheapest cost on the go, and that should potentially help you save a little bit on gas. Of course, alternatives there are using public transportation, biking, or walking, if that's an option for you. But again, lots of ways to save on these major spending categories for Canadians.
All right, don't go anywhere. Up next, we'll have our interview with the former president of Toronto Metropolitan University about the consequences of the federal government's international student cap. Stay tuned. Forum Daily will return after these messages. Months ago, Immigration Minister Mark Miller announced that Ottawa would reduce the cap on international student visas by an additional 10%.
But let's set the table further a little. When you look at the growth that we have seen in people that are temporary residents of Canada, that's something that has grown almost exponentially over the last few years, from about 437,000 individuals in 2019 alone to about 1.2 million in 2023. That comes with consequences, but let's not also forget the importance that immigration generally, the importance of people that are here on a temporary basis has done for the economy. The Bank of Canada has said it, the International Monetary Fund has said it, the immigration writ large has been in part responsible for preventing us from going into a recession, has been important for the net growth in the gross domestic product. Again, this has been important, and it's been important to the growth of the country, but I think it's safe to admit that we have allowed certain aspects of this to get overheated, and probably for too long.
On one side of the debate, supporters of the move argue that the large number of international students in Canada puts upward pressure on rents and that the system has been a gateway for fraud, with many international students arriving in Canada and claiming asylum or simply not intending to leave. However, on the other side of the debate, others have argued that international students provide a tremendous amount of value to the Canadian economy, to Canadian educational institutions, and that those institutions depend on international students as a revenue stream. Joining me now to discuss this debate is Sheldon Levy, former president and vice chancellor of Toronto Metropolitan University. Mr. Levy, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, as a former president of a university, what do you make of the argument that Canada is not benefiting from international students and that the costs associated are not worth the benefits?
Well, I don't hear the argument that the country isn't benefiting from international students. I even think the minister in his piece mentioned the benefit. I think the question was, did it get overheated, get it too large, and what were the consequences? But there is no doubt that the country benefited and the universities and the colleges benefit from international students.
Now, I want to stay with the critics. Are there educational institutions that are abusing the system, and how can that be fixed?
Well, there's no doubt that there are some that took advantage of the growth, but I know that they are in a vast minority, and therefore we shouldn't begin to see this as the only problem. But you fix it by better controls on the intake of the students. And I'll give you one good example of it. You have students that want to come to the country for education and then return to their home country after education. And there are students that want to come into Canada and after their studies get a postgraduate work permit and perhaps move to become a landed immigrant and maybe a citizen of the country. Well, those are two different streams. When it comes to the first stream, students should be open to all programs because they don't intend to stay. But for students that are tending to stay and looking for careers, for their benefit and the country's benefit, they should be far more aligned to the jobs available and the jobs in the future, and therefore more aligned to the economy. But the third thing we have to be careful about is never to turn our back on the best and the brightest. Every country is competing for the best minds in the world, and to have a cap on those students that come into graduate programs as the best and the brightest is not a good policy.
Now, you mentioned the economic benefits of these students. How does that compare to other major aspects of the Canadian economy?
Well, let me give you a few comparators. If you look at the Government of Canada's data, that in 2022, there was $38 billion brought in by international students, and this includes all aspects from food, shelter, tuition, and families visiting. The whole economic impact was roughly 32 billion. That grew before the changes by IRCC to around 50 billion. That is larger than all of forestry. That is larger than all of aerospace. That is roughly two-thirds all of auto. So it is a very, very large sector of our economy. And to lose a significant portion of it is to lose 20, $25 billion. And the impact, because students are in first, second, third, and fourth year, that impact is not felt for a number of years. But you can't lose that amount of money without feeling the impact in Canada.
And there have been some very high profile examples over the last month of colleges closing down programs or even entire departments because of the international student cap. Do you think schools became too dependent on international students and their higher tuition that they pay?
Oh, absolutely. The if you look in Ontario and you look that there have been no base grant increases for many, many years, and tuition is frozen. And but inflation continues, compensation continues to grow. The colleges and universities look for new revenue sources, and international students was there. And it was there in year one, year two, year three, and it kept on growing. But absolutely, you're right. It was far too dependent on international tuition fees.
And some would argue that part of the problem in terms of that dependence is the difference between tuition for a Canadian citizen and tuition for an international student. Do you think that the price difference has fueled that problem?
Well, when you look at the price for domestic students or Canadian citizens, they are coupled with an amount that the province pays, so that the revenue the institution receives is the tuition fee and the government grant. But when an international student comes, there is no corresponding government grant, so the student has to pay the full price, and therefore there's going to be a significant differential. And then the universities and the colleges are going to price it by what the market will bear and what is their competitive advantage, because they're looking for not only the students, but they're looking to ensure the students have a great education, but they do need the profit from it to be able to cover some of their costs.
And you were a former deputy minister in the province. What can or should the province do to maximize the benefits of international students?
Well, a lot of the responsibility begins with the federal government as well. But if one of the things that the provinces can do is if they fund the institutions or allow domestic fee increases, domestic fees to increase, there's going to take a lot less pressure off the institutions and the need for international education. But at the federal level, I think there has to be a much more strategic alignment between the economic needs of the country and the number of students. And as I said, for students that are planning to come to the country but have no interest in having a postgraduate work permit, that it should be a much more open process for the colleges and universities.
And how important is it to realign our international student program with such an uncertain economic future ahead of us?
Well, we have a number of challenges. One of them that no one has been speaking much about, but it's critical, is the birth rate or the demographic profile of the country. You have a country with many, many people at my age, call it the baby boomers, growing. But in order to be able to support that growth, you need a large group of people in the working group. And no different than South Korea, Italy, Germany, Canada, our birth rates do not meet the population needs we need, and therefore immigration is not only important to our country, it is going to become very, very competitive. And if we gain the reputation of turning away young people from our country, then they're going to be wanted by other countries that have the same challenge. And we can't simply turn on and turn off immigration of international students as if it's a faucet. So we have to be always prepared to be welcoming of a country and to put our best foot forward to encourage the best students in the world to want to come to Canada. Our birth rate is 1.26, which means that we are a declining population without immigration. And what better immigration is there than having international students that study here, learn, make sure they have a good understanding of the language, both English and French, and are in programs that make a difference to the economy, and at the same time meet their educational and aspirational needs. So one thing everyone has to do is make sure the world knows that Canada is a welcoming place for international students.
Mr. Levy, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for asking me.
In yesterday's press conference with Israel's Prime Minister, President Donald Trump said he wants the U.S. to take ownership of the Gaza Strip and redevelop it after Palestinians are resettled elsewhere.
The only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. It's right now a demolition site. This is just a demolition site. Virtually every building is down. They're living under fallen concrete that's very dangerous and very precarious. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live out their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back and do it again. The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different.
And after his comments, the president was pressed by CNN's Caitlin Collins on who would live in Gaza under U.S. ownership.
That they should go. And two, are you saying they should return after it's rebuilt? And if not, who do you envision living there?
I envision world people living there, the world's people. I think you'll make that into an international, unbelievable place. I think the potential in the Gaza Strip is unbelievable. And I think the entire world, representatives from all over the world will be there, and they'll live there. Palestinians also. Palestinians will live there. Many people will live there. But they've tried the other, and they've tried it for decades and decades and decades. It's not going to work. It didn't work. It will never work. And you have to learn from history. History has, you just can't let it keep repeating itself. We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent. But more importantly than that is the people that have been absolutely destroyed that live there now can live in peace in a much better situation because they're living in hell. And those people will now be able to live in peace. We'll make sure that it's done world class. It'll be wonderful for the people. Palestinians mostly we're talking about. And I have a feeling that despite them saying no, I have a feeling that the king in Jordan and that the general president, but that the general in Egypt will open their hearts and will give us the kind of land that we need to get this done, and people can live in harmony and in peace. Thank you all very much.
President Donald Trump also announced that the United States will withdraw from the UN's top human rights body and will not resume funding for the UN agency helping Palestinian refugees.
Next up, in light of numerous actions taken by a number of bodies of the United Nations which exhibit a deep anti-American bias, we have an executive order prepared for your attention that would withdraw the United States from the UN Human Rights Council, would withdraw the United States from the UNRWA, which is a refugee organization, and would also review American involvement in UNESCO, which has also exhibited anti-American bias. More generally, the executive order calls for a review of American involvement and funding in the UN in light of the wild disparities in levels of funding among different countries that, as you've
So I've always felt that the UN has tremendous potential. It's not living up to that potential right now. It really isn't, hasn't for a long time. It has, there are great hopes for it, but it's not being well run, to be honest, and they're not doing the job. A lot of these conflicts that we're working on should be settled, or at least we should have some help in settling them. We never seem to get help. That should be the primary purpose of the UN, the United Nations. And again, it's got great potential, and based on the potential, we'll continue to go along with it, but they got to get their act together.
What would they need to do, sir, to get their act together?
The U.S. stopped funding the agency assisting Palestinian refugees known as UNRWA after Israel accused it of harboring Hamas militants who participated in the attacks in southern Israel on October 7, 2023. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has told Panama's president that the country must reduce Chinese influence over the Panama Canal area or face potential retaliation from the Trump administration.
Can you tell us a little bit about the canal conversation you had with the Panamanian president yesterday?
Well, we had a frank conversation. What I expressed to President Molina, who, look, he's a friend of America. He is. He's a friend of America. Panama is a strong partner and ally of the United States. As the president has articulated, when we turned over the canal, we turned it over to Panama. We didn't turn it over to China. So you get there, and the Chinese control both entries to the port. Both entries to the port. We have a treaty obligation to protect the canal if it comes under attack, but our Navy is paying fees to go through there. So I express frustration about those things, and again, I understand that it's a delicate issue in Panama. We don't want to have a hostile or negative relationship with Panama. I don't believe we do. But we had a frank and respectful conversation, and I hope it'll yield fruits and results in the days to come.
On his first foreign trip as America's top diplomat, Mr. Rubio held talks with Panama's President Jose Raul Mulino in Panama City on Sunday. The president has resisted pressure from the new U.S. government over Panama's management of the waterway that is vital to global trade. Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com joined us for more on the canal.
Okay, so there's a lot of backstory here, and you got to piece through the nomenclature of who's using what language and terminology for what. America, of course, did do the Panama Canal. Jimmy Carter's administration did the deal to hand it back over to Panama. Now, since 1997, Panama has, for lack of a better word, outsourced the operations in the Cristobal Port on the Atlantic side to CK Hutchinson Ports Holding Group. Now, they've done it since 97, but they became a conglomerate in 2015, and they're based out of Hong Kong, and their leadership, previous leadership, does have a lot of ties to China. So once Hong Kong was taken over by China, you have that geopolitical stuff going on. So when somebody like President Trump or Secretary Rubio starts talking about China is controlling the Panama Canal, that's what they're referring to. Is it completely true? Partially. There is a worry that that's what's going on. Rates are going up, but shipping rates are going up worldwide also. And there's the little bit of the thing about the Carter administration giving it back in the first place, should they have done that. Now, there is a treaty in place for this. It's a negotiated treaty. There is language in there about America always has to have access to it. It does not say that we have to have control over it. And this is the kind of nitty-gritty details that Secretary Rubio, on behalf of the Trump administration, is highlighting and using as a leverage play, like we've seen with tariffs and like we've seen with a lot of other things. Usually when Trump says something really outlandish, like we're going to take back the Panama Canal, or we're going to make Canada a state, or whatever the case may be, it's a negotiating tactic to go to something that they want to try to get from those people. So what are we trying to get from Panama here? Is the China thing legit? There is truth to that. Is that a negotiating point that they're going to try to get a concession out of? Maybe. I don't know where that's going to go, but that's the background on why they're doing this, why they're saying this, and why they're making a point of emphasis of it. There is this thing where China has used real estate purchases in the commercial world to further their state interests. There was a lot of feedback a couple of years ago when they bought into Smithfield Foods, which is the biggest pork producer in the U.S., because the two biggest Smithfield production facilities are close to Norfolk, our largest naval base, and close to Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty in North Carolina, our largest Army facility. So the concern that people are given is, well, this is the Chinese getting close to Panama Canal, but it's important to know C.K. Hutchinson runs 53 ports in 24 nations, including Britain, Spain, and Australia. So while it's legitimate to kind of look into the ties with China, this is not a Panama Canal specific thing. This is not something where they bought it just to control it. This is a sprawling conglomeration that controls a lot of different things. All those layers are important to understand what's going on here above the rhetoric around the Panama Canal right now.
At least 10 people, including the gunman, have been killed at an adult education center in what Sweden's prime minister called the country's worst mass shooting. Sweden's prime minister gave a news conference in Stockholm in the aftermath on Tuesday's tragedy on the outskirts of Örebro. The school serves students over the age of 20 with primary and upper secondary school courses. It also offers Swedish classes for immigrants, vocational training, and programs for people with intellectual disabilities. The RCMP say that a person has been arrested in Saskatchewan after 4 people were found dead on Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation. The Mounties say that the 29-year-old suspect was accused of pointing a gun at people 95 kilometers away from the Zigame Anishinabek. The Mounties say that they don't know if the suspect is connected to the deaths, but are asking people to remain vigilant. They say that the 4 deaths east of Regina are being treated as homicides, and the initial investigation suggests that the home was targeted. Mounties say that the dead are 2 men and 2 women. Canadian captain Alphonso Davies has re-signed with German soccer club Bayern Munich. Davies' current contract expires on June 30th, but he has inked a new deal that will see him on the team through June 30th, 2030. He had played with the Vancouver Whitecaps before signing a record fee with Bayern back in July 2018. The 24-year-old from Edmonton is currently sidelined with a muscle strain in his left hamstring suffered on January 22nd. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca. Good night, Canada.